The skies above Earth boiled, stained with hues of crimson and black, as the murmuration descended like a storm of living shadows. It came in waves, an unrelenting tide of alien biomass that blotted out the sun and devoured entire continents beneath its relentless hunger. Cities became graves in hours. Entire forests withered into pale mulch as the organism consumed their roots and flesh alike. In the heart of what remained of New Avalon, Dr. Celia Rourke stood in the shattered remains of her lab. The reinforced observation windows were caked with ash and ichor, veiling the monstrosities outside. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the air laced with the acrid stench of burning organics, and something far worse, the putrid scent of the reshaped, those unfortunate enough to be absorbed into the murmuration's creeping tide. "Power at 28%, called out Aaron Vale, one of the last surviving engineers. His voice trembled, and Dr. Rourke knew it wasn't just from exhaustion. "We won't get a stable signal if the relays collapse again." "They won't collapse." Celia's voice was flat, her eyes fixed on the console before her. She keyed in the final sequences for the broadcast, a desperate call across the void, aimed at anyone who might hear. Vale swallowed hard. "Even if they don't, do you really think they'll answer? The stories, you know what they say about them." Celia didn't look up. "The stories also said we'd be dead by now, but we're still here." She didn't have to look at him to know what he was thinking. She knew how ridiculous it all seemed, a primitive world begging for salvation from beings who viewed themselves as gods. They had barely cracked interstellar signals while the rest of the galaxy was centuries ahead in weapons, science, and exploration. And yet, what choice did they have? The murmuration was an enemy unlike any other, a life form that did not conquer or communicate. It consumed. She leaned closer to the console, her fingers trembling over the input keys as she whispered the final command. Transmit above the ruined spire of the research center. An array of towers began to hum. Their cores glowed faintly as the signal pulsed outward, a desperate, unrelenting beacon cast into the galactic dark like a flare above a sinking ship. Celia didn't pray. She no longer believed in miracles. But as the low thrum of the signal built in intensity, she allowed herself one fleeting moment of hope. Thousands of light years away, deep within the core planets, the Galactic Coalition's High Accord Summit was in full session. The hall was vast, built from crystalline columns that refracted light into a spectrum of ethereal blues and golds. Dozens of species filled the chamber, their forms alien and wondrous, feathered Velith, shimmering Silurens, and the armored colossi of Zelvari Prime. They gathered beneath the massive central orb known as the Aureus Sphere, where the most urgent transmissions from across the galaxy were displayed. The sudden flicker of red pulsed across the Aureus, followed by a harsh, warbling audio transmission. Human voices, desperate, raw, filled the air. "This is Earth. We are under attack by an entity we cannot comprehend. Our world is burning. Please, if you can hear this." The voice cracked, replaced by a resonant hiss of static. The Aureus cycled through images captured from the transmission. A world aflame, the monstrous sprawl of the murmuration, spreading like a cancer. tendrils of flesh, buildings split apart like ripe fruit as hybrid monstrosities spilled from their husks. For several moments, silence reigned. Then came the laughter. Low at first, then rippling through the delegates, a chorus of dismissive amusement. The grand arbiter lore of the Silorans, an iridescent being with glass-like skin, raised one crystalline limb. Humans, Lore said with a chime-like voice, the ones who barely scraped their way into our star charts with their crude satellites? Yes, another delegate, Zareth Vra of the Zelvari, rumbled. His jagged carapace clicked as he folded his armored arms. And now they beg for salvation. How quaint. The hall filled with chuckles, though some remained silent, too unnerved by the imagery displayed to join the revelry. At the back of the chamber, a lone figure stood, his expression grim beneath the hood of his travel cloak. Caden Holt, once a diplomatic envoy to uncharted systems, now a pariah. He watched the transmission replay, his stomach twisting as he saw the alien horrors writhing across Earth's surface. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "You think this is a joke?" The laughter died as heads turned. Holt's piercing gaze swept across the room. "I've seen this before, not this exact species, but things like it. Organisms that don't just conquer, they annihilate. This murmuration isn't just a human problem. It's an extinction-level threat, and you're all too arrogant to see it." Lore clicked its shimmering fingers in amusement. "The Coalition has faced countless terrors, Caden Holt. We endured the fall of Ysera Prime, the war against the Helmar Swarm, and yet we remain. The humans, they are insignificant," Zareth Vra finished, baring his fangs. Holt's fists clenched. "That's what every doomed world says, until they burn." He gestured toward the fading image of Earth. "We could help them. It wouldn't cost you anything to listen, but instead you'll wait. And when the time comes, when you face the same horrors, you'll remember this day." Lore tilted its head, crystalline ridges shifting in something akin to amusement. "If the murmuration spreads that far, perhaps we shall remember. But for now, let the humans perish with whatever dignity they can muster." The Aureus sphere dimmed, the final echoes of humanity's cry fading into nothing. Caden Holt turned and walked out of the chamber, his heart heavy with rage. Back on Earth, Dr. Rourke waited beneath the looming remains of the relay array, her eyes scanning the sky for any response. The stars flickered, cold and indifferent. She closed her eyes. No answer, just silence. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a slow, sickening vibration. Vale stumbled forward, wide-eyed. "It's here." A sound, wet and pulsing, filled the air. The walls around them trembled as something massive surged in the distance. Celia lifted her gaze toward the horizon and saw it, a sea of churning black flesh, undulating like waves of diseased tissue, rising and falling as it consumed everything in its path. She didn't run. There was nowhere left to go. Instead, she whispered to the stars one last time, "If anyone's listening, please." Then the murmuration crashed down upon the city, and the world dissolved into chaos. The first planet to fall was Velarnis, a mid-rim colony world known for its crystalline forests and serene oceans. The Galactic Coalition received only fragmented reports before contact was lost. A garbled distress signal and images of the surface warping into a writhing landscape of bone-white tendrils and blackened pustules. Entire cities were drowned beneath alien biomass that spread like wildfire, converting every living thing into something other. By the time the Coalition's fleet arrived, Velarnis was dead. The planet's atmosphere churned with toxic clouds, and grotesque shapes slithered across the ruined cities below. High Commander Belric, leader of the Zelvari Armada, ordered orbital bombardment with full confidence that their weapons would cleanse the planet. The plasma lances carved through the planet's surface, their searing brilliance enough to reduce worlds to glass. But as the fires cooled, the crew of the flagship Verity's Wrath stared in disbelief. The biomass moved. Chunks of flesh and bone twisted, knitting themselves back together with hideous speed. From the ruin, new structures emerged. Alien towers formed from twisted cartilage and glistening muscle, stretching skyward in obscene imitation of civilization. The murmuration had adapted. The Coalition fleet was unprepared for the retaliation. Black tendrils thicker than warships shot upward from the planet's surface, snaring the vessels like insect prey. Hulls crumpled and burst apart, raining molten debris into the atmosphere. In the midst of the chaos, horrific shapes began to crawl out of the planetary remains, twisted amalgamations of bone, sinew, and machinery, assembled from the wreckage of both the murmuration's victims and the ships it had consumed. Flesh titans, massive constructs with pulsing hearts and shifting faces, rose to challenge the fleet. High Commander Belric's final broadcast was a howl of rage and terror before the Verity's Wrath was dragged into the atmosphere, disappearing beneath a sea of chitin and bile. Velarnis was swallowed whole. By the time news of Velarnis spread to the core worlds, fear had set in. The Coalition convened an emergency summit, and for the first time in over a century, there was no laughter in the high accord chamber. The Aurea sphere displayed a live feed from Calvast 9, another outer system colony that had fallen silent. The feed flickered with interference as it captured the nightmare below, a landscape in flux, cities bleeding into rivers of biomass, the air thick with spores. The murmuration's spread was rapid, precise, and without mercy. What remained of the colony's population was grotesquely visible. Flesh spires adorned with twitching limbs, screaming faces barely recognizable in their mutated forms. Grand Arbiter Lore spoke, its crystalline form dim. This should be impossible. No biological entity should spread this way, across planets, between systems, with no visible form of containment. Impossible? General Vrita Morsic of the Zelvari leaned forward, her silver-plated armor dented from a recent skirmish. It is happening. We thought our weapons were untouchable. Now we know better. The chamber rippled with uneasy murmurs. Caden Holt watched silently from the periphery. He had warned them, but vindication tasted bitter. He knew what came next. The bargaining, the scramble for answers when none existed. The galaxy's mightiest powers were reduced to frightened children trying to make sense of the monster lurking in the dark. "Enough," Rita Morsic growled, her voice a serrated edge. "We need a countermeasure." Lore's voice was almost wistful. "If only we had heeded the human's signal." The chamber fell silent. All eyes turned to Caden. His expression was grim as he stepped forward. "There may still be a way." The mission to Earth was an admission of failure disguised as diplomacy. The Coalition dispatched a fleet of emissaries, Zelvari dreadnoughts flanked by Silaran escort vessels, under the guise of extending an alliance to the remnants of humanity. But every delegate aboard the fleet knew the truth. They weren't offering salvation. They were begging for it. When the fleet arrived at the Sol system, they expected desolation. Instead, they found something far stranger and more unsettling. Earth had survived. The planet's surface was scarred beyond recognition, entire continents warped into jagged landscapes of ash and ruin. But what caught the emissaries' attention was the massive... The emissaries requested permission to land. After a tense pause, Rourke's voice returned. "Come, but understand this. You walk on graves." The delegation touched down in what remained of New Avalon, escorted by armored human figures whose very presence was unsettling. They were called Resonants, soldiers augmented by bioorganic machinery that pulsed and shifted beneath their exosuits. Their faces were hidden behind opaque visors, but their very movements felt wrong, as though their limbs were held together by something barely human. Celia Rourke waited in the shadows of a ruined tower, her figure almost unrecognizable. Time had not been kind to her. Her skin was pale, threaded with black veins where the murmuration's corruption had taken hold before the resonance forge halted it. Her right arm was a mass of intertwined cables and reinforced muscle tissue, pulsing faintly with energy. The Silaran delegate recoiled instinctively at the sight of her. "You survived this." "We adapted," Rourke said coldly, "while you watched from your ivory towers." She gestured to the massive structure behind her, the towering Vesper Array, a construct of alien steel and neural amplifiers designed to destabilize the murmuration's biological cohesion. "This is what you mocked us for, and now it's the only thing that can save you." The Zelvari general stepped forward. "Then help us. Teach us how to fight this thing." Rourke's gaze was sharp. "Help? We begged for help. You left us to die. Now you want us to risk what's left of our species to save yours." Caden Holt stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Celia, they're here because they're scared, and scared people can be dangerous. If we don't fight together, there won't be anything left to fight over." She studied his face for a long time before nodding. "Fine, but if we do this, it's on our terms." The Vesper arrays were deployed across Coalition space in the following weeks, guided by human resonant units who synchronized their nervous systems with the machines. At first, the results were staggering. Entire murmuration swarms collapsed into inert matter, their cells ruptured by the disruptive frequencies. But the murmuration was still evolving. On the fringes of the battlefields, new forms began to emerge. Grotesque hybrids of alien flesh and sentient hosts. The murmuration was learning from its victims, refining its approach. In hushed whispers, Coalition soldiers began to speak of the whispered, Former comrades who had been consumed and reshaped, now piloting their grotesque bodies with horrifying precision. As the battlefields grew bloodier, the truth became clear. Humanity's fight had only just begun, and the galaxy was closer to its end than it dared to admit. The galaxy burned. Planets once teeming with life were reduced to rotting orbs wrapped in sinew and bone. Entire star systems became nothing more than feeding grounds for the murmuration's ever-expanding mass. In every corner of Coalition space, the same horror repeated. Tendrils of living tissue coiled around moons and orbital stations, breaking them apart like brittle shells. On the colony world of Eris Phi, the planet's core ruptured, spilling molten rivers that carried fragments of twisted, half-living architecture into orbit. The murmuration had become unstoppable, or so it seemed, until humanity struck back. The first deployment of the Vesper Array marked the beginning of the galaxy's most brutal counteroffensive. The murmuration's swarm boiled over the industrial world of Havros Prime, turning its cities into sprawling nests of cartilage and fungal spires. Coalition forces had fallen back, unwilling to sacrifice more ships to the quagmire. But Earth's fleet, the reforged Saber Armada, arrived in silence, a storm of jagged black warships built from scavenged remains and human ingenuity. At the helm of the NSC Ironwake, Dr. Celia Rourke sat rigid, her half-cybernetic frame thrumming with the resonant pulses of the array's systems. Her body was dying, but she didn't care. Beside her stood Commander Eric Varen, one of the first Resonants to survive full synchronization with the Vesper Core, a feat that left his body grotesquely altered. His left arm was a lattice of carbon fiber bones and sinew, and his face was obscured behind a black visor that hummed faintly with bioelectric pulses. "Resonance core is stable," Varen muttered, his voice filtered through layers of distortion. "Synchronization holding at 91%. "Good." Rourke's voice was sharp, cold. "Initiate the pulse." The ship's core glowed, veins of pale light snaking across the deck as the array began to hum, a sound that built into an agonizing crescendo. Moments later, a shock wave rippled outward, invisible but devastating. The murmuration's biomass shuddered violently, the living towers collapsing in on themselves as their cellular bonds ruptured. Massive flesh amalgamations screamed, a wet, piercing howl, before disintegrating into pools of liquefied tissue. Coalition ships, watching from the periphery, erupted in cheers. Humanity had done the impossible, but Rourke knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The Vesper arrays worked, but they demanded a price. The neural feedback was catastrophic to the human operators. Each synchronized resonant became a conduit for the energy pulses, their nervous systems overloading with every activation. Their bodies began to wither and deform, bones cracking as their tissues were racked by subsonic distortions. Most resonants didn't survive more than 3 activations before their hearts gave out or their bodies ruptured. Yet, humanity continued to fight. On Gravis Station, soldiers with broken limbs held their posts as their amplified suits kept their twitching muscles from unraveling. On the dying moon of Selvaris, resonants deployed handheld emitters and died where they stood, their skin bubbling away as their pulses ripped through the murmuration's horde. Their sacrifice became legend across the galaxy, but their survival was never guaranteed. The Coalition leaders watched the battles unfold with a mixture of awe and horror. Even the hardened Zelvari general, Vrida Morsik, looked pale as she viewed a live feed of humanity's assault on Jara's Ring, a vast spacefaring fragment of the Murmuration's hive. The battle was nothing short of apocalyptic. Human resonants hurled themselves into the writhing flesh tunnels, detonating Vesper grenades that sent shockwaves through the bioorganic structure. Entire squads died in the process, but they won. Grand Arbiter Lore, shimmering dimly in the command chamber of the Coalition's capital, whispered in disbelief. How can they endure such suffering? Caden Holt, standing nearby, answered with grim certainty. Because they don't have a choice. Despite humanity's victories, the Murmuration was learning. The first sign of its new adaptation came on the storm world of Zeros 5, where the Vesper Array's pulse met unexpected resistance. What should have been a clean rupture turned into a grotesque feedback loop. Tendrils lashed out from the Murmuration's mass, coiling around the emitters and fusing into their frames. Within moments, the biological matter began to rewrite itself, mimicking the resonant frequencies rather than breaking apart. Varen's voice crackled over the comms. We've got a problem. From the remnants of the hive emerged a new form, Murmurants. These were once human hosts, reshaped into towering creatures of sinew and bone, yet eerily conscious. Their mouths moved, but the words they spoke weren't their own. Too late, one of the Murmurants rasped, its voice wet and layered with static. You cannot unmake us. We are one now. The sight of their former comrades, now puppets of the Murmuration, sent waves of despair through the Coalition's ranks. Entire battalions broke formation at the sight of the Murmurants, their minds unraveling as they watched the creatures walk with agonizing familiarity. Humanity didn't break. On Sargus Drift, Rourke herself led the final assault against a Murmurant hive. Her Vesper pulse disintegrated the creature's flesh, but not before she saw their faces. Familiar, lost. When the battle ended, she sank to her knees, clutching her warped arm. Varen approached, his synthetic voice low. You can't carry this alone. She looked up at him, her face hollow. There's no one else left. The galaxy teetered on the edge of annihilation as the Murmuration's hive mind grew in power. Every victory cost humanity more than it could bear, yet they pressed forward. The Coalition forces, who once mocked Earth's desperation, now followed humanity's lead without question. They watched in stunned reverence as human resonants, despite their ruined bodies, stood tall on the front lines. But Rourke knew that time was running out. The Vesper arrays were losing their effectiveness. The Murmuration's new adaptations meant that soon, even the most powerful pulses would only slow its spread. Humanity's survival demanded a new solution, one that no one wanted to consider. We've only delayed the inevitable, Rourke said during a final war council. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. The Murmuration isn't just an enemy, it's a process. If we want to win, we need to cut out the core. The room went silent. Everyone knew what she meant. The Accord, Vareen murmured. The Zenith Accord was humanity's ultimate weapon, a Vesper array powerful enough to rupture the Murmuration's hive mind across all known sectors. but its range was devastating. Anything within 100 light years, human or otherwise, would be destroyed. The coalition erupted into protest. "You'll annihilate millions," Lore's voice cracked. "Entire worlds will burn." Rourke stood slowly, her frail but imposing figure casting a long shadow. "They'll die anyway if we do nothing." Her gaze hardened. "You wanted our help. This is how we survive." The council fell into silence, and for the first time, the galaxy's leaders saw humanity not as victims, but as something greater, something terrifying. In the end, they agreed, because they too had no choice. The stage was set for the final battle. Humanity's Resonants, half dead and scarred beyond recognition, prepared to activate the Accord. As the last ships took their positions in the ruins of Sargus Drift, Rourke whispered into the comms, "To anyone listening, you mocked us. You watched us burn. But now, you'll see what humanity can become." The countdown began. The pulse was primed, and across the stars the murmuration screamed. The galaxy held its breath. Above the ruins of Sargus Drift, the Coalition fleet stood in grim formation, a sea of warships silhouetted against the fractured remains of a distant nebula. The wreckage of entire civilizations floated among the stars like forgotten prayers, their broken hulls etched with the silent echoes of despair. Below them, in the heart of the drift, the murmuration's core hive pulsed, a massive living wound in reality, its surface shifting and writhing, as if the galaxy itself was trying to tear free from its grip. The countdown had begun. The Zenith Accord was primed, humanity's ultimate weapon, their final defiance, thrummed with the raw power of destruction. Across the command decks, screens lit with warnings as the array's reactors surged toward critical mass. Inside the control chamber of the NSC Ironwake, Dr. Celia Rourke stood at the center of the chaos, encased in the skeletal arms of her synchronization rig. Pale light coursed through the veins of her cybernetic implants, casting sharp shadows over her gaunt face. Her heart thudded in weak, uneven pulses, but her mind burned with unbreakable resolve. "Final resonance lock established," Commander Eric Vereen said over the comms. His voice was a distorted rasp. His visor flickered, revealing brief flashes of his ruined face beneath, the last remnants of the man he used to be. "We're ready." Rourke's voice was soft but steady. "Understood." She turned toward the viewport, where the murmuration's endless tendrils reached out like fingers of some ancient god, wrapping around the remnants of ships, moons, and worlds. The core hive loomed ahead, a shifting, grotesque cathedral of flesh and bone, vast enough to eclipse entire fleets. Through its translucent membranes, she could see them, the whispered, the hybrid beings the murmuration had shaped from the bodies of its victims. Rourke's eyes lingered on their faces. Some were human. Others were Zelvari, Vaelith, and Silaran, soldiers who had once fought with hope in their hearts. Now they drifted within the hive's biomass, their bodies fused with alien tissue, their mouths whispering words that didn't belong to them. She closed her eyes. There was no salvation left for them. The comms crackled as Caden Holt's voice came through from the bridge of the Aurora's reach. "Celia, are you sure about this?" Rourke exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the inside of her visor. "You know the answer." A long silence. Then Holt's voice returned, softer now. "I just thought someone should say it out loud." Celia's chest tightened. Memories of Earth flickered through her mind, the rust-colored sunsets over the ruins of Avalon, the smell of salt air from oceans long swallowed by the murmuration's blight. She thought of the people they'd lost. She thought of the stars they'd never see again. "This was never about winning," she whispered. "This was about making sure they remember us." Varen's voice cut in. 30 seconds to detonation. Rourke opened her eyes. Her trembling fingers brushed the activation key, and for a fleeting moment she thought about the billions of lives caught in the blast radius. Entire colonies, ships, and outposts, all doomed because of what humanity had been forced to unleash. She whispered to no one in particular, "I'm sorry." The resonance pulse began to build, a low hum that deepened into something primal, something that reached into the marrow of every living thing. The ship's walls groaned as the energy surged outward. Across the fleet, human and coalition alike watched in stunned silence as space itself seemed to twist and shudder. Inside the murmuration's core hive, the alien mass convulsed, its tendrils thrashing wildly as the pulse tore through its structure. Screams, not human, not alien, but something vast and incomprehensible, echoed across subspace. The core hive began to collapse, its layers unraveling into molten streams of biomatter that boiled away into the void. But then, the murmuration spoke. A voice, vast and multitudinous, rippled through the calms in a whisper that made blood run cold. "You think you've won." Rourke's eyes widened as the whisper deepened, growing into something more than sound, a presence that pressed against the walls of her mind. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time in years, she felt true fear. "You are not the first to resist. You will not be the last to fall." She gritted her teeth, fighting against the weight of the voice. "No," she hissed. "We're not like the others. We're human, and we don't fall, we rise." With a final surge of strength, Rourke slammed her palm against the activation panel. The resonance core exploded in a blinding cascade of light. The ship's hull disintegrated instantly, consumed by a wave of pure energy that rippled outward in all directions. The pulse swept across the battlefield, annihilating everything in its path. Coalition warships shattered into fragments. The core hive imploded, its writhing mass collapsing into a singular point of raw, pulsating agony before vanishing into silence. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no stars. And then the silence was broken by a faint signal. On the distant edges of the galaxy, beyond the reach of the destruction, a coalition scout ship intercepted the transmission. The signal was weak, garbled with static, but unmistakable. A single voice. Human. The transmission played across the scout's comms, filling the cockpit with a soft, trembling whisper. "If you can hear this, we're still here." The crew exchanged stunned glances. Tears welled in the eyes of the Valith pilot as they replayed the message. The galaxy had watched humanity burn, but this, their final transmission, was not a cry for help. It was a declaration of survival. Years later, historians would speak of the Zenith Accord as both a tragedy and a triumph. Entire systems had been lost in the blast, but the murmuration was gone, wiped from existence. The galaxy rebuilt in the aftermath, though it was never the same. The coalition had been broken, humbled, and yet humanity's name endured. In the wreckage of Sargass Drift, the coalition salvaged the last remnants of the Iron Wake's hull. Carved into the twisted steel, preserved by the pulse's strange resonance, was a single phrase: "We will not be forgotten." In the darkness between the stars, the galaxy remembered the signal, the last heartbeat of a species that had been mocked, abandoned, and left to burn. They remembered humanity not as victims, but as something far more terrifying, something that had refused to die. And somewhere in the vast unknown, another pulse, faint but growing, stirred in the void. The signal played again. "We're still here." And this time the galaxy listened.